The camera glides over turquoise water so bright it looks photoshopped, sweeping toward the twin wings of Basse-Terre and Grande-Terre, the butterfly-shaped island the world calls Guadeloupe. But the first name, Carukera, Island of Beautiful Waters, came from the Kalinago, long before the French carried their maps, muskets, and miraculous ability to discover places already packed with people. We're in the Lesser Antilles, tucked between Dominica and Antigua, right where the Caribbean Sea kisses the Atlantic, and where empires came to play pirate with entire populations. These mountains? Especially the smoking presence of La Soufrière. They've witnessed more rebellion than a century of angry group chats. Those flat plains of Grande-Terre? Perfect for sugar, which is exactly why things go downhill. Fast. When the French arrived in 1635, led by Charles Léonard de l'Olive and Jean du Plessis d'Aussonville, they filed one of history's most predictable reports. We have found a paradise fit for cultivation. Translation. We're about to clear this island like it's a browser history. Within a generation, indigenous defenders are decimated, African captives are forced into relentless cane fields, and the French Empire is bragging about wealth it extracted from bodies it pretended not to see. Still, the island holds its memory. Maroon footpaths threading the mountains, cane fields whispering old resistance songs, and names passed quietly between generations who survived the impossible. Listen closely, past the surf and mangrove wind. There's a heartbeat steady and stubborn. A promise that Guadeloupe never surrendered. Not then. Not ever. Before the French, before the plantation mills, before the word colony became Guadeloupe's unwanted nickname, the island was a living system, managed, cultivated, understood. The Kalinago, who arrived centuries earlier from the South American mainland, built their villages along river mouths where the sea breeze cut the heat and freshwater cradled cassava fields. They called themselves the Kalinago, though Europeans would mislabel them Caribs, in yet another example of colonizers getting the names wrong. In the writings of Jean-Baptiste Dutertre from the 1660s, he described the Kalinago as bold navigators, which is 17th century French for "these people sail better than us, and we're slightly embarrassed about it." Their canoes, some capable of carrying 50 people, stitched the archipelago together, linking Carukera to Waitukubuli, which we now call Dominica, to Ai, which became Saint Croix, and to Haiti, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. These weren't random voyages. They were calculated trade missions, diplomatic exchanges, and kinship visits across a maritime highway they'd mastered for generations. They practiced rotational farming that prevented soil depletion, grew cassava as their staple crop alongside sweet potatoes, peppers, pineapple, and cotton. They fished with intricately woven traps that captured specific species while letting others pass. Sustainable practices that would make modern environmental scientists blush with envy. They held communal harvesting rituals that doubled as social events, maintained ancestor veneration ceremonies that preserved oral histories, and operated complex diplomatic systems that managed inter-island relationships and occasionally conflicts with neighboring groups. But to Europeans, anything not involving steel armor, written contracts, and feudal paperwork apparently didn't count as a real society. If you didn't have a king dripping in ermine and a system of hereditary peasant oppression, you were somehow primitive. The Kalinago also defended their territory fiercely. Leaders like Kalinago Ketsi appear in French chronicles, described as unyielding and refusing all attempts at peaceful submission, colonial code for wouldn't let us steal their land without a fight. They understood the landscape deeply. The ridges where morning mist provided cover, the hidden paths through volcanic rock formations, the coves where a canoe could vanish into mangrove shadow before pursuing ships could turn. Village life centered on kinship networks that extended across islands, seasonal fishing expeditions timed to migrations and moon phases, and trade routes that connected islands across hundreds of miles of open water. Women held significant roles in Kalinago society, managing agriculture, controlling food distribution, and participating in community decisions. Their social structure wasn't the European patriarchal hierarchy. It was something colonizers couldn't quite grasp and therefore dismissed. Before colonization, the island was not waiting to be discovered. It was living, thriving, choosing its own rhythm, feeding its people, and navigating its own future. And then, in 1635, France walked in like it owned the place. When French ships anchored off Guadeloupe on June 28, 1635, the Kalinago approached for diplomacy. Europeans approached for domination. The mismatch was immediate and, in hindsight, entirely predictable. The Compagnie des Îles d'Amérique, a private trading company chartered by Cardinal Richelieu, granted the French the right to settle the island. This was a legal claim written by people sitting in Paris with zero jurisdiction over land they'd never seen, negotiating with nobody who actually lived there. Colonial logic. If we write it on paper and stamp it with a royal seal, it's true. Kalinago logic. Touch our land and find out what happens. The initial French party included Charles Léonard de l'Olive and Jean du Plessis d'Aussonville, along with roughly 550 colonists, merchants, soldiers, indentured servants, and a handful of Dominican missionaries, whose job was to provide spiritual cover for theft. They established their first settlement at Pointe Alegre, near modern-day Sainte-Rose, immediately demanding provisions from nearby Kalinago villages. Hostilities escalated within months. According to the 1640 report by Governor Charles Houel, who would later purchase the entire island like it was investment property, the French demanded food, labor, and land access. The Kalinago refused all three. Fighting erupted across Basse-Terre's coastal plains and into the interior highlands. Kalinago warriors used ambush tactics perfected over generations of inter-island conflicts, hitting supply lines, striking from forest cover at dawn, vanishing into river valleys before French reinforcements could arrive. French troops, weighed down by metal armor designed for European battlefields and egos too heavy to carry through tropical humidity, struggled desperately in the terrain. The French established a fort at Basse-Terre, which became the colonial capital, but found themselves essentially besieged by a population that knew every trail, stream, and hidden approach. Supply ships from France arrived irregularly. Disease tore through the colonial settlement. Within the first year, more than half the original French colonists died from fever, dysentery, or Kalinago arrows. To colonial leaders, resistance meant the indigenous population was warlike and treacherous. Imagine being mad that people don't want strangers showing up, demanding everything they own, and calling it a business opportunity. Truly baffling behavior. Between 1636 and 1650, disease, warfare, and forced displacement shattered the Kalinago population. European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, spread rapidly through communities with no immunity. French military expeditions burned villages, destroyed cassava fields, and captured Kalinago people to sell as enslaved labor to other islands. Survivors fled to Dominica, where descendants still maintain communities and cultural practices today. The French claimed the land was now pacified. No, it was depopulated. Entire villages stood empty, their structures left to rot in tropical rain. Cassava gardens overgrew into jungle. Fishing grounds fell silent. Where paper maps declared victory with neat boundary lines and French place names, the people who kept the island in balance were gone. Into that void, colonizers planted cane and death. With indigenous resistance violently crushed, plantation dreams expanded. Governor Charles Huel, who purchased Guadeloupe outright in 1645 for 60,000 livres, yes, you could buy entire islands if you had the right connections and zero conscience, invested heavily in sugar production. Sugarcane had been introduced experimentally earlier in the century by Dutch traders who understood its profit potential, but now it became the engine driving everything. Mills rose along rivers where water power could crush cane stalks. Fields spread across Grande Terre's flat limestone plains like a geometric plague. Profit calculations replaced any remaining human considerations. But cane requires labor, violent, grinding, endless labor that breaks bodies and destroys lives on an industrial scale. And since the French had just destroyed the people who lived here, they turned to the transatlantic slave trade. The first enslaved Africans arrived in the 1640s, purchased from slave traders operating out of West African coastal forts. They came mainly from Senegambia, the region between the Senegal and Gambia rivers, and Congo regions in Central Africa. The ships made the middle passage across the Atlantic. Weeks of horror in cramped holds, chained bodies, disease, death, and trauma that no historical distance can soften. Those who survived the crossing stepped onto Guadeloupean soil already depleted, sick, and immediately thrown into plantation labor. The plantation model hardened quickly into brutal efficiency. Endless fields of cane on Grande Terre's eastern plains, processing mills positioned by rivers, refineries where raw cane became crystallized sugar, warehouses at ports, and overseers with whips serving as the empire's preferred management style. Ships arrived regularly at Pointe-à-Pitre and Basse-Terre, unloading human cargo into a system deliberately designed to extract maximum labor before death made replacement necessary. Enslaved Africans faced catastrophic mortality rates. Contemporary ledgers from the Montluzan estate show workers barely lasting 7 years on average before dying from overwork, malnutrition, disease, or despair. 7 years. Children born into slavery often died before reaching productive working age. Women suffered the highest mortality rates, subjected to field labor during pregnancy and sexual violence without legal recourse or protection. When your business model relies on replacing human beings faster than you kill them, maybe reconsider your business. Or, if you're a 17th century French plantation owner, just order more ships from Africa and call it economic development. By 1670, Guadeloupe's economy was fully dependent on African enslavement. Sugar exports to France increased yearly. Wealthy planters built mansions in Basse-Terre. Port cities expanded. And underneath all that supposed prosperity lay an ocean of suffering that account books tracked in tonnage and profits. A new society was being built, but on the ruins of 2 others, and those ruins still haunted the cane fields. Enter the Code Noir, issued by Louis XIV in 1685, a masterclass in colonial hypocrisy. On paper, it orders planters to baptize enslaved people, provide food, prohibit torture. In reality, it legalizes slavery, enforces violence, and reduces human beings to property. Article 38 lists punishments for runaways: branding, ear-cutting, hamstringing, death. Article 44 states enslaved people are movable property. Article 2 demands forced conversion to Catholicism. Any violation? punishable by fine or confiscation, meaning the system protects itself, not the enslaved. But enslaved Guadeloupeans carved out spaces of survival anyway. Nighttime gatherings, drum circles disguised as religious meetings, herbal medicine passed between generations, clandestine marriages, whispered stories from Africa that kept memory alive. Women became the keepers of language, food traditions, and spiritual practices that colonial authorities tried repeatedly to suppress. The Code Noir was France's attempt to regulate inhumanity the way you might regulate fishing seasons, completely missing the point. Even as law tried to shrink their humanity, enslaved people rebuilt it daily, and some rebuilt it by escaping into the mountains. Guadeloupe's mountains, deep green, volcanic, armored with mist and nearly impenetrable vegetation, became the sanctuary of the Maroons, escaped Africans who refused bondage and carved freedom from hostile terrain. Colonial pursuit logs mention a leader named Zamba who led raids on plantations near Vieux-Habitant around 1720. French authorities described him as dangerous and elusive, which translates to effective at what he does, and we can't catch him. Maroons built hidden camps near rivers and waterfalls, choosing locations that provided fresh water, fish, and natural defenses. They planted small provision grounds of yams, plantains, cassava, and other crops stolen from plantations during raids. These gardens were deliberately scattered and camouflaged, making them nearly impossible for French troops to locate and destroy. They launched nighttime raids to free others still enslaved, burned cane fields to disrupt production schedules, and attacked isolated overseers who ventured too far from plantation centers. The terrain was their co-conspirator in ways French military commanders found endlessly frustrating. Troops tripped over roots in the darkness, sank into mud that swallowed boots and morale, got disoriented in dense bamboo groves where every direction looked identical, and lost direction despite having competent guides, according to a 1723 military complaint that somehow blames the forest for being inconvenient. Imagine invading someone's homeland and being confused the forest isn't on your side. Imagine expecting the mountains to just cooperate with your slave-catching expedition. Maroon communities developed their own governance structures, leadership councils, security rotations, and dispute resolution systems that functioned without written law or colonial interference. They established security networks with enslaved people still on plantations, receiving early warning of militia movements and intelligence about weak points in plantation defenses. They maintained trade relationships, exchanging forest goods, medicinal plants, wild game, timber, for metal tools, cloth, and salt that couldn't be produced in mountain camps. Some Maroons had escaped from specific African ethnic groups, Congo, Mandinka, Wolof, and recreated cultural practices in the mountains, drumming ceremonies that maintained religious traditions, naming rituals for children born free, and oral histories that preserved memories of Africa and the Middle Passage. Others formed new creolized communities, blending African practices with indigenous survival knowledge learned from remaining Kalinago contacts or from the landscape itself. They proved that freedom was not just an abstract idea, but a physical location. Deep in the mountains of Karukera, where the old indigenous trails still remembered how to hide people, and the volcanic ridges provided natural fortifications. Despite brutal expeditions against them, bounties offered for captured Maroons, tracker dogs imported from other colonies, militia sweeps that burned suspected camp locations, Maroon communities persisted throughout the 18th century. Colonial authorities never eliminated them, only pushed them deeper into the interior. Freedom grew wherever the forest could hide it, watered by determination and defended by people who'd already survived the unsurvivable. By the mid-18th century, sugar ruled everything. The Montluzan estate ledger from 1764 lists over 140 enslaved workers divided by skill categories, age ranges, and assigned value. Human beings catalogued like livestock with depreciation rates calculated based on expected working years. This is the era when Guadeloupe becomes a profitable cog in France's Atlantic machine, producing thousands of tons of sugar annually for European markets that consumed it in coffee, chocolate, pastries, and the sweet taste of other people's suffering. Daily life? Dawn to dusk labor under the Caribbean sun that turned the cane fields into open-air ovens. Cane cutting with machetes that dulled against woody stalks and sliced fingers when exhaustion made hands clumsy. Mill turning powered by human muscle pushing massive wooden arms in endless circles. Boiler rooms hotter than volcanic vents, where sugar juice crystallized in copper pots and workers collapsed from heat stroke. Overseers armed with whips and pistols stationed at field edges. Food rations barely enough to sustain life, usually salted fish, cassava flour, and whatever could be grown in tiny garden plots enslaved people tended on Sunday afternoons. Women facing constant sexual exploitation with no legal recourse, no protection, no recognition that their bodies belonged to themselves. Children began working by age 6 or 7, initially carrying water or clearing weeds, gradually advancing to full field labor that stunted growth and destroyed young bodies. Families could be separated at any moment through sale, punishment, or plantation inheritance disputes. Punishment for resistance ranged from whipping to branding to mutilation. Ears cut off, tendons severed, bodies marked permanently as warnings to others. Yet culture thrived in the margins slavery couldn't quite control. Drumming circles on Sunday, rest days that maintained African rhythms and religious traditions, Creole language blending African syntax and grammar with French vocabulary and Caribbean innovations. Healing rituals combining herbal knowledge from multiple African regions with local plant discoveries, naming traditions that kept ancestral connections alive across generations. Resistance strategies whispered in the darkness between barracks where overseers couldn't hear. Women became the primary keepers of memory, passing down stories, songs, and survival techniques to children. They maintained food traditions, transforming meager rations into meals that carried cultural significance. They organized clandestine markets where enslaved people from different plantations could trade goods, share information, and maintain social networks the plantation system tried to fragment. Plantation owners lived in mansions funded by suffering they pretended was God's order, or natural hierarchy, or economic necessity, because nothing says divine will like profit margins built on human exhaustion, and nothing screams natural like a system requiring constant violence to maintain itself. The island's wealth had a currency written in broken bodies, stolen childhoods, and generations born into inherited trauma. But then France had a revolution, and everything catches fire. Revolution in France sends shockwaves through its colonies in 1789. White planters demand autonomy to protect slavery. Free people of color, the mixed-race population with some legal rights, demand full civil equality. Enslaved people listen intently to talk of liberty, equality, fraternity. A letter from 1790, written by a free man of color in Pointe-à-Pitre, demands recognition. We have shed our blood for the crown. We demand the rights of men. Planters ignore it. France dithers, caught between revolutionary ideals and colonial profits. Tensions climb across the island. Nothing scares slave owners like people reading philosophy. Free people of color organize politically. Some enslaved workers slow production, test boundaries, whisper about rights. White planters arm themselves, terrified that liberty might actually mean everyone. Political chaos fractures plantation authority, creating openings for resistance that seemed impossible just years earlier. The Atlantic carried more than sugar. It carried ideas. And ideas, unlike sugar, cannot be contained in barrels. Revolutionary Commissioner Victor Hughes lands in Guadeloupe in April 1794. Accompanied by a small revolutionary force and carrying one of the most explosive documents in Caribbean history, the National Convention's decree of February 4, 1794, abolishing slavery across all French territories. He defeats British occupying forces who'd seized the island during the revolutionary chaos, and immediately implements the Abolition decree despite fierce planter opposition. He arms formerly enslaved men, forming black battalions who fight fiercely for the Republic against British and Royalist forces. These soldiers understand exactly what's at stake. Their newly won freedom depends on military victory. They fight with intensity that terrifies British commanders, pushing occupation forces off the island within months. Plantation order collapses overnight like a house of cards, finally admitting it was always unstable. White planters flee to neighboring islands, Antigua, Dominica, Martinique, or face revolutionary tribunals that seize their property and sometimes their lives. Freed people reclaim African names that slavery tried to erase, reunite with family members sold to different estates years earlier, and seize limited autonomy within revolutionary structures. For the first time in 150 years, Black Guadeloupeans walk as citizens, not property. They negotiate work conditions, demand fair treatment, and hold legal standing in courts. Guadeloupe becomes the Caribbean's brief experiment in revolutionary black citizenship, with mandatory military service, corvée labor requirements, and price controls. Because freedom apparently came with fine print that kept people tied to plantation production. The transformation is imperfect and contradictory. Hughes implements a labor regime that still requires work on former plantations, now as wage laborers rather than enslaved people, but with movement restrictions and production quotas that limit actual freedom. The revolutionary government needs sugar exports to fund its wars in Europe, so Black Guadeloupans find themselves caught between genuine citizenship rights and economic demands that echo slavery's rhythms. But the psychological shift is seismic and irreversible. People negotiate terms instead of obeying orders, refuse abusive treatment without facing death, and hold legal standing that means something. They marry legally, register children as free citizens, sue employers for unpaid wages, and vote in some local councils. The Republic, whatever its contradictions and failures, recognizes their humanity in ways that transform daily existence. Freedom backed by armed resistance and revolutionary decree reshaped the island's fundamental social structure. But across the Atlantic, a certain ambitious Corsican general is consolidating power, and he's not amused by Caribbean experiments in black equality. Napoleon Bonaparte orders slavery restored in French colonies through the law of May 20, 1802. General Antoine Reshaped arrives in Guadeloupe with 3,500 battle-hardened troops in early May. Guadeloupe resists. At the center stands Louis Delgrès, a free man of color born in Martinique, a revolutionary officer who fought for France in multiple campaigns, and someone who refuses to surrender the rights Black Guadeloupeans won in 1794. His proclamation, issued on May 10, 1802, from his headquarters in Basse-Terre, still burns through history. To the entire universe, the last cry of innocence and despair, We will know how to be free or die. He calls Napoleon's decree a betrayal of revolutionary principles, a violation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and a return to tyranny dressed in imperial uniforms. He rallies hundreds of soldiers and civilians to armed resistance, men and women who fought for the Republic and now face the bitter reality that the Republic has abandoned them. Fighting erupts across Basse-Terre on May 10th. Former enslaved soldiers, knowing exactly what re-enslavement means because they lived through it before 1794, battle French troops in mountain passes, coastal towns, and fortified positions. They're outnumbered 3-1, outgunned by artillery and naval support, but fight with the desperate courage of people defending their children's freedom. Battles rage at Basse-Terre, Pointe-à-Pitre, and across the interior highlands. Outnumbered and facing inevitable military defeat, Delgrès and approximately 300 followers, soldiers, women, children, anyone choosing death over chains, retreat to the Danglemont plantation at Matouba on May 20th. The plantation sits on volcanic slopes with steep approaches, easily defensible, but ultimately a trap. They fortify positions, gather weapons, and wait. Richepence's forces surround them by May 28th. Artillery bombards the plantation. Infantry advances up the slopes. Richepence sends surrender offers. Lay down weapons, accept clemency, return to plantations. Delgrès knows what clemency means. Chains, deportation to French prisons, brutal punishment as examples to others. With French troops closing in and capture imminent, Delgrès makes a final choice. He lights the gunpowder kegs stored in the plantation building. A deafening explosion echoes across the mountains, so loud that people in coastal towns hear it and understand what it means. Approximately 300 people die instantly, choosing death over slavery, choosing to deny Napoleon his victory of humiliated captives. Napoleon declares victory. His victory is a graveyard, a smoking ruin, and a symbolic defeat that haunts French colonial history. Within months, slavery is fully reinstated across Guadeloupe. Richepense hunts down remaining rebels. Thousands are deported to prisons in France or sold to other colonies. Hard labor, chains, and systematic terror return to the cane fields. The brief experiment in black citizenship ends in blood and gunpowder. But Delgrès becomes the symbol of Guadeloupe's unbreakable refusal. His proclamation is taught in schools. His name marks streets, monuments, and public squares. The date May 27th becomes a memorial day. The explosion at Matouba echoes forward through generations as proof that some things matter more than survival, like refusing to live as someone else's property. Napoleon loved liberty, just not for people growing his sugar. He loved the rights of man, just not for black men who took those rights seriously. After re-enslavement, resistance shifts form and becomes harder for historians to track. But that doesn't mean it stops. It just becomes quieter, more strategic, more deeply embedded in daily survival. The records rarely preserve names, but we glimpse lives through punishment logs and plantation correspondence that document infractions and discipline. One woman, recorded only as Mina in an 1832 ledger from Sainte-Rose, was whipped for insolence. Translation: refusing a command, talking back to an overseer, asserting her basic human dignity. Another man was jailed for teaching others to read, literacy being terrifying to slaveholders because educated people can forge passes, read abolitionist newspapers, and understand the philosophical arguments undermining slavery. Others run away repeatedly, accepting the risk of brutal punishment for even brief tastes of freedom. They sabotage machinery by accidentally breaking equipment, poison livestock to reduce plantation productivity, work slowly enough to undermine quotas without triggering immediate punishment, and pass warnings about overseer movements. Cultural resistance thrives in spaces the planters cannot fully police. Clandestine marriages conducted in secret ceremonies that blend African traditions with Catholic elements. Market women selling provisions on Sundays and passing information between plantations. Nighttime drum gatherings disguised as Catholic saint festivals, where African religious practices continue under colonial noses. Whispered prayers blending African deities with Catholic saints in a syncretic spirituality that neither abandons African roots nor fully submits to forced conversion. This is survival as defiance. Maintaining humanity the system tries to crush. Women play crucial roles in preserving culture and organizing resistance. They control the informal economies around plantations, grow food and provision grounds that supplement inadequate rations, maintain healing knowledge using herbs and African medical traditions, and teach children survival strategies and cultural memory. They're also the most vulnerable to sexual violence from overseers and owners, yet they organize networks of protection and support among themselves. Across the Atlantic, abolitionist pressure grows in France throughout the 1830s and 1840s. Missionaries witness and criticize the brutality. Abolitionist societies publish testimonies. Plantation profits decline as sugar markets shift. Cuban and Brazilian production increases, and beet sugar in Europe reduces dependence on Caribbean cane. But change comes slowly, resisted by planter lobbies who control colonial policy and threaten economic disaster if slavery ends. Enslaved Guadeloupeans continue pushing daily against the system's limits, creating small zones of autonomy, garden plots that provide food and tiny income, healing practices that offer physical relief and spiritual connection, kinship networks that planters cannot break despite their attempts through sale and separation. The system weakens under the weight of its own contradictions, its brutal inefficiency, its need for constant violence to maintain itself, and the relentless pressure of those it tries to control. Freedom was not given by benevolent French legislators. It was prepared through decades of quiet rebellion, cultural preservation, and survival strategies that kept hope alive. Then, 1848 arrives, with a revolution in France and a deadline for Caribbean slavery. Abolitionist Victor Schulcher signs the decree ending slavery across French colonies on April 27, 1848. In Guadeloupe, word arrives on May 27, 1848. Crowds gather in Basse-Terre's main square. Bells ring from the cathedral. Plantation authority collapses within hours. Reports say people danced in the streets of Pointe-à-Pitre. Others walked miles to reunite with family members separated by sale decades earlier. Many left the plantations immediately, seeking land, wages, dignity, and the right to control their own labor. Schulcher gets statues. The people get their lives back. Let's be clear who did the heavy lifting, but freedom is declared within a colonial framework that France still controls absolutely. The administration quickly enforces a colonial police system, discriminatory taxes targeting Black Guadeloupeans specifically, and vagrancy laws designed to keep former enslaved people working on plantations by criminalizing unemployment. Emancipation without land redistribution or resources creates new struggles. Former enslavers receive financial compensation for their property loss. The French government literally pays them for losing their enslaved workers. The formerly enslaved receive nothing. No land, no compensation for generations of stolen labor, no reparations for trauma and violence. Still, May 27, 1848 transforms everything. People choose new surnames, establish independent communities in the hills, negotiate wages from positions of legal personhood, and refuse conditions they endured under bondage. The psychological shift is irreversible. They are citizens now, not property. And that fundamental recognition cannot be taken back even as colonial structures try to limit its meaning. Freedom changes everything, but not enough. And planters quickly find a loophole: new laborers for old exploitation. To maintain cane production after abolition, France imports thousands of indentured laborers from India, China, and Madeira. The first Indian workers arrive in 1854 aboard the ship Aurélie, stepping onto Guadeloupean soil under 5-year contracts that promise wages, return passage, and fair treatment. Reality delivers something else. Conditions echo slavery: 12-hour workdays in cane fields, corporal punishment from overseers, movement restrictions that trap workers on estates, wages often withheld or paid in plantation scrip useless elsewhere. Many die from tropical diseases they have no immunity against. Colonial authorities turn a blind eye to abuses. When your entire economy relies on exploitation, you don't reform the system, you rebrand it. Yet indentured communities build lives within these constraints. Indian workers establish temples, maintain Bhojpuri language and Hindu festivals, create foodways that blend South Asian and Caribbean ingredients. Chinese workers form merchant networks. These communities add new layers to Guadeloupe's cultural fabric, though their arrival is rooted in colonial labor extraction. Indenture officially ends in 1889, but plantations continue dominating land and politics well into the 20th century. Out of this emerges a new Creole society: African, Indian, European, indigenous descended, and island-rooted. The plantation ghost still lingers, but new voices demand change. The early 20th century brings worker strikes, school protests, and rising political consciousness. Leaders like Gertie Archimede champion workers' rights and women's rights, organizing unions and challenging discriminatory laws. Paul Valentino speaks against economic inequality and colonial administration's neglect of Black Guadeloupeans. In 1946, Guadeloupe becomes an official French overseas department. Paris promises equality, development, and integration. Reality offers uneven development, limited political autonomy, and persistent racial disparities in employment, education, and wealth. The 1952 cane workers' strike shuts down harvests across the island. The 1967 Pointe-à-Pitre riots, sparked by racial violence, leave dozens dead and expose deep tensions. Intellectual movements of the 1970s push for social justice, cultural recognition, Creole language rights, and economic independence. Departmentalization made Guadeloupe French on paper, but not necessarily equal in practice. It's the bureaucratic version of saying, "We hear you," then ignoring the email. Modern Guadeloupe is shaped by circular migration to metropolitan France, cultural renaissance in Creole language and zouk music, environmental movements protecting coral reefs and forests, and ongoing debates about autonomy, identity, and justice. The relationship with France remains complicated, legally integrated but culturally distinct, economically dependent but politically restless. Resistance continues, but now through politics, culture, and community organizing. The island's story doesn't end. It evolves, carrying forward centuries of refusal to be defined solely by colonial terms. The camera rises over La Soufrière, its steam curling upward like whispered memory. Below, drum rhythms drift from a village festival, African heartbeat, Indian cadence, Creole soul. Cane fields flicker in the wind. Maroon trails hide in the forest. Del Grey's name lives in a schoolyard mural. Centuries tried to break this island, but Guadeloupe learned to bend, resist, reshape, and rise. Carruquera, the island of beautiful waters, still carries the echo of every person who dared to claim freedom against the empire that tried to deny it. And that echo is not fading, it's growing.